My name is Ilara Quinn, and for most of my life, I thought silence was the safest way to survive my family. I learned to shrink myself so my sister could shine, to swallow the bruises that never showed, to believe that being overlooked was better than being in the line of fire. But everything changed the day I realized she had not just taken credit for my work or my opportunities. She had begun taking pieces of my identity as if my life were something she could claim. I did not know that leaving that house would pull me into a storm of lies, stolen credit, whispered rumors, and a courtroom that would finally force the truth into the light. All I knew was this: if I stayed silent any longer, I would disappear completely. By the time the guests started arriving, the house already felt like it belonged to my sister. My parents live in a quiet cul-de-sac in Plano, Texas, the kind of neighborhood with trimmed lawns and matching mailboxes. But that night, it could have been Madison Ellis and Company headquarters. Her logo was on the drink napkins, her brand colors in the floral arrangements, her face in framed photos on every console. People stepped through the front door and greeted my parents with the same line over and over: "That boutique of Madison is incredible. You must be so proud." I stood near the entry table with a stack of coats in my arms and smiled on reflex. Dad brushed past me to shake hands with one of his colleagues, chuckling as he told him that his oldest daughter was the business genius of the family. His hand landed briefly on my shoulder, a touch so light it might have been accidental, and then he was gone, already halfway into a story about how Madison had built her stores from the ground up. Mom swept in from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers and paused when she saw me still standing there. She asked why I was not circulating, said that I was making the doorway feel crowded. I shifted aside and asked if she wanted me to take the tray. She answered that Madison had hired servers for the evening and that I should just try to enjoy myself. The words were kind, but the tone made it clear that I was in the way. In the living room, everyone clustered around Madison. She wore a white jumpsuit that made her tan look deeper, her hair smooth and perfect. People leaned toward her as if she were a warm lamp in a dark room. When she noticed me on the edge of the circle, she lifted her glass and said that Rowan finally made it down from Austin, still doing art stuff. The group laughed politely. One woman asked what kind of art, and as I started to answer, Madison cut in and said that I had always been very creative, the kind of free spirit who did not worry too much about money. The woman turned back to Madison and asked about expansion plans for the boutique chain. Little comments like that are nothing by themselves, but they pile up. Later, I found myself beside Madison near the kitchen island while the crowd thinned and people drifted toward the back patio. She was scrolling through her phone, checking tagged photos from the event. I told her that the place looked beautiful and that she had really pulled off the rebranding. She smiled at the screen instead of at me. She said that at least one of us had figured out how to use our talents in the real world. Then she added, in that light joking tone she uses when she wants to say something sharp without being called on it, that our parents worried about me, that they wished I would stick with something stable instead of bouncing between design contracts in Austin. I tried to brush it off, but she kept going. She said I had always been the emotional one, that I could not handle stress, that it was better for the family if she handled the serious things, especially money. My stomach tightened. I asked what she meant by serious things. She shrugged and said that Mom and Dad had a lot on their plates and that she helped them sort out finances sometimes, but that it was not really my concern since I had chosen to live hours away. I felt like someone had put a glass pane between us. On one side was the life she shared with them, investments and decisions and pride. On the other side was me, the guest on my own parents' house. A little later, I walked past the dining room and heard my name. My parents were standing with an older couple who had known us since childhood. The couple was telling them how amazing it was that Madison had taken a small loan and turned it into a multi-city brand. Mom laughed and replied that Madison had always been the hardworking one, even back when she earned that college scholarship that paid for almost everything. The scholarship had been mine. I remembered the long nights at the dining table, sketching until my hand cramped. the portfolio I sent to the art school, the call that made me cry with relief. Hearing my mother casually hand that memory to Madison felt like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged the bones. I stepped back into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and counted my breaths until my throat stopped burning. In the front hall, there was a small stack of mail that someone had moved off the console table to make room for decorations. A plain white envelope sat on top, my name printed in a font that didn't look like a personal card. I picked it up without thinking. It was from a national bank, the kind with branches in every grocery store. The letter inside thanked me for my recent application and explained that they needed additional information to process a new credit account. I had not applied for anything. I read the letter twice, then a third time, looking for some sign that it was a mistake. The address was my parents' house. The date was 2 weeks earlier. The hallway felt too warm. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the sounds of the party, Madison's laugh carrying over the music. I folded the letter and slipped it into my bag. It could have been a simple clerical error, but paired with Madison's comment about finances and things not being my concern, it sat heavy in my mind. The night pushed on. Guests grew louder, the air thick with perfume and wine. At some point, Dad tapped a spoon on his glass and called everyone into the living room. He said that Madison wanted to say a few words. People gathered around, phones out, ready to record. Madison smiled at the crowd and spoke about family and gratitude and how thankful she was for her parents, who had always believed in her. She talked about hard work and risk and told a polished story about the early days of her business. Then she turned slightly toward me, still looking at the room, and said that every family has a dreamer who never quite lands, and that sometimes the rest of the family has to be practical for them. The room laughed. I felt the blood rise in my face, but my feet stayed still. She did not say my name, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. I was the dreamer who never landed, the one they had to be practical for. I saw my parents smiling politely, not correcting her, not stepping in. Something inside me finally clicked into place. I set my drink on the side table, smoothed my dress, and walked to the entryway. Nobody stopped me. I collected my small crossbody bag and my keys from the bowl near the door. I did not slam anything or announce that I was leaving. I simply stepped out into the cooler night air and let the door close softly behind me. The quiet on the street felt like a different planet. The hum of distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the wind brushing the leaves on the trees. All of it steadied me. I sat in my car for several minutes staring at the glowing windows of my parents' house, at the silhouettes moving past the curtains. Then I started the engine and drove to a motel near the freeway. In the morning, I returned. The house was silent, the aftermath of a party, scattered everywhere. Empty glasses on the counters, confetti on the floor. Mom came into the hallway when I was rolling my suitcase from my old bedroom. She frowned and asked what I was thinking I was doing. I told her I was heading back to Austin earlier than planned. She said that I was making a scene, that I had overreacted to a harmless speech, and that Madison had only been joking. Dad appeared behind her, rubbing his temples, and told me that families say things they don't mean, that I should not be so sensitive. Neither of them asked why I had a suitcase. I didn't argue. I had spent years trying to explain how their small cuts felt, and nothing had changed. I just nodded, walked past them, and loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my dusty sedan. The drive from Plano to Austin took a few hours. I watched the landscape change from neatly manicured suburbs to stretches of open highway and clusters of trees, then to the low sprawl of North Austin. My phone buzzed several times in the cup holder, messages I didn't read. The credit letter sat folded beside me, a quiet weight. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot of the small apartment complex I had found on short notice, the sky was pulling toward evening again, pale blue fading to orange at the horizon. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of the cooling car. Everything I owned now fit into the back seat and trunk. My parents' house, my place at their table, the version of myself who believed that one day they would see me clearly, All of that was behind me on the highway. I stepped out of the car, breathed in the dry Austin air, and lifted my suitcase from the trunk. The apartment building was old and a little worn, but the porch light over my new front door glowed warmly. I walked toward it, the gravel crunching under my shoes, feeling the first thin line of a life that would finally belong to me. Chapter 2. Starting Over. The porch light over my new door flicked on as the sun slipped down, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without the sound of anyone else moving in the next room. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of unpacking, emailing studios, sending portfolios, and watching my bank balance shrink. The apartment was small and a little crooked, but it was mine. I bought a second-hand table from a neighbor and set up my sketchbooks and laptop by the window. From there, I could see a strip of Austin sky and the tops of tired oak trees leaning over the parking lot. I took whatever work I could find, small freelance projects for local cafes and online shops, but each payment seemed to disappear into rent and groceries as soon as it arrived. One night, scrolling through job postings with a cup of instant ramen cooling on the table, I saw an opening for a junior designer at a studio in New York. The listing mentioned textile work and branding, exactly the mix I liked most. The studio was in Brooklyn, a neighborhood called Clinton Hill that I had only ever read about. Something in me sat up. I told myself I was just checking it out as I tailored my resume and portfolio and sent them off. The next morning, there was already a reply in my inbox. The owner, Gina Hartman, wanted to do a video interview that week. Gina appeared on my laptop screen in a pressed black shirt and red lipstick, hair pulled back, eyes sharp but not unkind. She asked direct questions about my process, about deadlines I had missed in the past, about how I handled criticism. When I admitted that I had sometimes frozen up when feedback felt personal, she nodded slowly and said that honest self-awareness was rare. She told me she liked my eye for pattern and texture, and that her studio needed someone who could work quickly without getting precious about revisions. 2 weeks later, I was dragging a suitcase up another set of stairs, this time in an old brick building in Clinton Hill. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. Walk up, narrow hallway, paint peeling in places. It cost more than anything I had ever paid for rent, but when I turned the key and stepped into the empty room, the view of brownstone roofs and a slice of Manhattan skyline made the risk feel almost rational. Gina's studio was a 15-minute walk away, on a tree-lined street squeezed between a coffee shop and a small gallery. Inside, the space smelled like paper and ink and espresso. White tables were scattered with fabric swatches, Pantone books, and half-built mock-ups. A big industrial fan hummed softly in the corner. On my first morning, Gina introduced me to the team, 3 other designers and 1 project manager. She told them my name, that I was from Texas, and that I was here part-time for now. Then she looked at me and said she expected me to work like I was full-time. I nodded and told her I understood. The first client brief she handed me was for a boutique hotel in Queens that wanted a new pattern for their lobby textiles. Clean, modern, but still warm, was how the brief described it. I stayed late into the evening, sketching variations, scanning them into my laptop, playing with color. By the end of the week, I had 3 options I felt good about. The client call happened on a gray Wednesday afternoon. Gina shared her screen with my designs while I sat off camera, notebook in hand. The hotel owner said that option 1 looked like an airport carpet, and option 2 looked like something his grandmother would have liked. Option 3 made him go quiet for a long moment. Then he said at least it did not make him angry, but it felt flat. Gina thanked him for the honesty and promised we would come back with something stronger. After the call, she closed her laptop and turned to me. She did not soften the blow. She told me that the work was competent but safe, that the colors felt muddied and the shapes indecisive. She said that if I wanted to survive in New York, I had to stop designing like I was asking for permission. I felt my throat tighten, the familiar heat of embarrassment rising, but I made myself listen. I took notes, even on the parts that stung. Gina watched me for a moment, then added that she had not hired me because she thought I would be perfect right away. She had hired me because she saw flashes of something unusual in my portfolio, and she wanted that version of me, not the one trying to guess what would please everyone. On my walk home, I replayed her words and felt the old soundtrack of my family overlap with them. Sensitive, overreacting, not practical. Those phrases had carved grooves in my brain, and criticism slid into them easily. But Gina's face had not carried the smugness of Savannah's. She had not enjoyed saying those things. She was pushing, not mocking. A few days later, a letter arrived at my Clinton Hill mailbox. The envelope bore the same bank logo as the notice I had found at my parents' house. Inside, the paper explained that there had been unusual activity on a credit account associated with my name. They wanted me to call a number to verify recent charges on a card I had never seen. I sat at the small kitchen counter with the letter in my hands, feeling that same heavy pressure in my chest. First, the application notice in Plano, now this. I thought of Madison, of her offhand comment about finances and things that did not concern me. It could have been coincidence, data entry errors, some glitch in a system. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into a folder with my lease and employment documents. I told myself I would deal with it once I had made it through my first month at the studio, one crisis at a time. A week later, Gina brought a man into the studio and introduced him as Noah Reyes. He was in his late 30s, with dark hair pulled back at the nape of his neck and a quiet, evaluating gaze. Gina told us that Noah ran a small gallery 3 blocks away and that he's the reason she keeps getting interesting clients. Noah walked slowly around the room, looking at the pieces on the walls, at the test prints on the tables. When he reached my desk, he paused at one of my personal sketches, tucked under a stack of client work, a repeating pattern of fractured leaves in deep teal and rust. I moved to slide it out of sight, embarrassed, but he shook his head. He asked how long I had been working in that style. I told him it was something I played with when I had time, that it didn't always fit briefs. He nodded and said that the pattern had a restless energy he liked, that it felt like it was breaking out of its own grid. His words lodged somewhere under my collarbone in a way the hotel owner's comments had not. Later, when Gina and Noah were standing by the coffee maker, I heard her mention that Noah was planning a fall exhibition focused on emerging textile artists. She said he was still finalizing the lineup. Noah replied that he hadn't decided yet, that he was looking for work that felt honest rather than trendy. That evening, as we closed up the studio, Gina stopped by my desk. She told me that Noah had asked whether I would be interested in showing a small collection in his exhibition. She added that she said he should ask him himself, but that she thought it was a good opportunity. She looked at me closely and said that if I agreed, she expected me to treat it like real work, not a side hobby. On my walk home, I imagined my patterns hanging on white walls, people leaning in to look closely, seeing things I put there on purpose and things I didn't realize were visible. The image thrilled me and made me queasy at the same time. At my kitchen table that night, surrounded by swatches and pencils, the voices of my family crept in. Dreamer, unstable, not practical. I stared at the blank page for a long time, wondering if saying yes to an exhibition was another example of me chasing something that would fall apart. Then, I thought of the hotel client and his bored tone, of Gina refusing to sugarcoat, of Noah's simple comment that my pattern looked like it was breaking out of its own grid. I thought of sleeping in a motel off the highway instead of going back into my parents' house. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to Gina, saying that if Noah was still interested, I would like to commit to the fall show. She responded a few minutes later with a simple confirmation and a reminder of the rough timeline. The next morning, I cleared a corner of my living room and taped large sheets of paper to the wall. I pulled out every sketchbook I had carried from Texas and spread them across the floor. I chose a thread to follow, a feeling more than a theme, something about fracture and repetition and finding order inside chaos. Days began to revolve around the studio and my apartment. I would clock out from client work, walk home with my headphones in, make a simple dinner, and then stand in front of the wall until my back ached. Some nights, the only thing I managed was erasing a few lines and redrawing them. Other nights, the hours disappeared, and I would look up to find that the sky outside had shifted from blue to black without me noticing. One humid Sunday afternoon, with the window open and traffic noise drifting up from the street, I stepped back from the wall and saw that the first piece was finally complete. The pattern of broken leaves had evolved into something denser, bolder, a field of shapes that almost vibrated where they overlapped. It looked like nothing I had done on commission. It looked like mine. I sank down on the worn rug, legs shaking more from emotion than from standing, and let myself really see it. This was not a client-pleasing draft or a compromised version of an idea. It was the first clear mark of whatever I was becoming here, far from the house where I had been a convenient shadow. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance. Inside, the room was quiet. I picked up my phone, took a photo of the piece, and sent it to Gina with a brief note saying that the first panel for the show was ready. Then I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes, feeling, for a rare and steady moment, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Chapter 3: The Exhibition and the Attack. The weeks after I finished that first piece slipped into a rhythm of the work, paint-stained hands and late nights. By the time September slid into October, the collection had grown into 5 large panels and a handful of smaller studies. Noah came by the studio every few days to check in. He would walk from piece to piece with his arms folded, tipping his head like he was listening to something only he could hear. One afternoon, he stopped in front of the 3rd panel and glanced at me. "This one feels like you stopped trying to be polite," he said. I laughed, a little embarrassed. "That obvious, huh?" "In a good way," he answered. "People are going to feel this when they walk into the room." The idea of people walking into any room and feeling anything because of something I made felt unreal. But the dates on the calendar kept moving. Postcards went out with my name printed under the title of the show. Gina taped one to the studio fridge and told everyone we were not allowed to embarrass her. Exhibition night came with clear air and a restless buzz in my chest. The gallery sat on a corner in Fort Greene, brick facade washed in warm light. Inside, the walls that had been bare when I first visited now held my work in clean white frames. Noah had arranged the panels so they seemed to move around the room, each one picking up a rhythm the last one had started. Guests arrived quickly after the doors opened. I heard the low hum of conversation rise and split and move. Someone from a local arts blog asked Noah to introduce them to me. A woman from a small museum in Queens took a card and told me she loved the tension in the patterns, that they felt like something trying to break through. I stood there, nodding, smiling, shaking hands, repeating my name as if I had always done this. Near the back of the room, a man in a navy blazer with a simple silver name tag studied one of the panels for a long time. Noah leaned close to my ear and said that was Mark from a national home goods retailer, that his approval could mean actual money and distribution. My stomach flipped. I watched Mark move from piece to piece, taking occasional notes on his phone, his expression unreadable. For a little while, I forgot about my family, about Texas, about the letters from the bank still sitting in a folder under my bed. The only world that seemed to exist was this one, full of paint and comments and the clink of glasses from the temporary bar Noah had set up by the window. I was standing near the entrance talking to Gina when the air shifted. People tend to turn their heads in the same direction when someone with a certain kind of presence walks in, and I felt the wave of attention before I saw her. Savannah stepped through the door as if the gallery belonged to her. She wore sleek black trousers and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back, two employees from her Plano boutique walking a half step behind. For a second, I truly believed I was hallucinating. Then she caught my eye and smiled, wide and bright. "Rowan," she said, voice loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. "Look at you." Gina stiffened beside me. I could feel Noah watching from across the room. I managed a careful "hi" and asked what she was doing in New York. She lifted a shoulder. "The store is doing a little buying trip, and Mom mentioned you were doing some art thing here. I figured we would surprise you, show some support." The words were generous on the surface. The way her eyes slid over my work, assessing and cool, told a different story. She moved through the gallery with her employees orbiting her, pausing in front of each piece and murmuring to them. They nodded dutifully. At one point, I saw her lean close to a woman from the museum and say something that made the woman glance at me, then look quickly away. Within half an hour, there was a slight change in the way people approached me. A few asked casually where I had studied and whether I had ever worked for a certain famous designer in Los Angeles. Someone else mentioned a resemblance between my patterns and a well-known collection from 2 years ago. The sentences were almost friendly, but the repetition gave them a different weight. Noah touched my elbow and drew me away from a cluster of guests into a quiet corner near the office door. "I need to tell you something before it gets bigger," he said softly. My chest tightened. "What happened?" "We got an anonymous email earlier today. It came to the general gallery address. I did not want to drop it on you right away, but people are starting to talk, and I'm pretty sure it's connected." I swallowed. "What did it say?" "It claimed you have a history of mental instability," he chose each word carefully, "and that you have stolen concepts from previous employers. It referenced one of your old studios in Austin by name." I stared at him, feeling the familiar dizzy distance creep in at the edges of my vision. "And you believed it?" "No," he answered quickly. "I checked with Gina. She was furious. We deleted it and flagged it, but somebody clearly forwarded it or mentioned it to guests. The timing is too neat." Through the open office door, I could see one of Savannah's employees scrolling on her phone, whispering to another. I didn't need proof stamped in ink to know what was happening. I'd grown up with this woman. Rumors were her favorite currency. On the outside, I kept my shoulders loose, my face calm. Inside, the urge to run from the room scraped against the decision I'd made months earlier in that Texas driveway. I was tired of leaving so that other people could stay comfortable. "Do we know where it came from?" I asked. Noah shook his head. The address was a free mail account with a random string of letters, but I asked the shop next door to pull their security footage this week to help with another issue, and something interesting showed up. He gestured toward the office. "Come see." In the small back room, a computer monitor glowed on the desk. Noah clicked a file, and grainy black and white video filled the screen. It showed the alley behind the gallery and the small row of studios across from it, including the entrance to mine. A timestamp in the corner marked 2 a.m, 3 nights ago. A slim figure in a long coat approached the studio door. The hood covered their hair, but when they turned slightly toward the camera, the light caught a familiar, sharp profile. One of Savannah's employees, the blonde with the precise bob, the one currently sipping wine near my second panel as if nothing was out of place. My hand curled around the back of the chair in front of me. "Nothing was reported stolen from your space," Noah said quietly. "Your locks were not damaged, but whoever that is had no legitimate reason to be there. Combine that with the anonymous email and the whispers tonight. It fits," I finished for him. We let the footage loop once more. the figure standing at my door, looking down at something in her hand before walking out of frame. Then Noah closed the window and turned to me. I need to ask them to leave, Savannah and her entourage. This is your night. I thought of Savannah telling me our parents' finances didn't concern me, of my mother giving my scholarship to her in a story, of a letter from the bank thanking me for an application I hadn't submitted, the fraud alert that arrived in Brooklyn weeks later. Now this, here, where I had finally felt solid. If you throw them out, I said slowly, it will look like I'm the one who can't handle pressure. That's what she wants people to say. Noah studied my face. So, what do you want to do? I straightened, smoothing my dress with hands that trembled only a little. I'm going to finish this night, and then I'm going to deal with her properly, but not in front of my work. He nodded once. If you change your mind, I'll back you. When we stepped out of the office, the gallery felt louder, edges sharper. Mark from the retailer was standing with Savannah near my largest panel. She was smiling up to him, head tipped in the angle she used when she wanted something. As I approached, he cleared his throat. We were just talking about your pieces. There's definitely something interesting here. With the questions that came up tonight, though, we're going to need to do a little more background before we move forward. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't neutral either. A door that had been cracked open an hour ago was now only barely ajar. I understand, I said. I forced my voice to stay level. If you have concerns, I'm happy to answer them directly. He gave a polite smile that meant nothing and drifted away. Savannah watched him go, then turned to me. Up close, I could see the satisfaction tucked in the corners of her mouth. You looked really overwhelmed for a second there, she said lightly. These things can be a lot. All those people, all those opinions. Are you sure you're up for it? I met her eyes and was startled by the calm I heard in my own voice. I'm doing fine, I said. You should enjoy the show. She blinked, perhaps thrown by the lack of visible reaction, then shrugged and turned back to her employees. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Some guests continued to offer genuine compliments. Others approached with that cautious distance people use when they're not sure which version of the story to believe. I smiled when it was required, answered questions, accepted business cards. Inside, something was solidifying, like clay fired in a kiln. By the time the last group left and Noah locked the door behind them, my feet ached and my cheeks hurt from holding expressions in place. The gallery was quiet again, the air still carrying the faint smell of wine and perfume. Gina stacked empty glasses at the bar and glanced over at me. You handled that better than most people who have been in this city twice as long, she said. I let out a slow breath. It did not feel like it. It did from where I was standing, she replied. Go home, sleep. Tomorrow we start cleaning this mess up. On the sidewalk outside, the streetlights pooled on the pavement. I looked back through the front window at my work hanging on the walls, then at the reflection of my own face superimposed over it. Savannah had turned what should have been my clean beginning into another battlefield, but something was different this time. I was not the girl sneaking out of a Texas house with a suitcase and shaking hands. I had proof. I had people who believed me, and I had my own name on a gallery wall in Brooklyn. As I walked toward the subway entrance, the decision settled quietly inside me. This was no longer about surviving her moods or ducking her insults. She had come into my life and tried to set it on fire. I was done playing defense. Chapter 4. The Legal War. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my apartment door. It was not frantic, just steady, like whoever was outside had all the time in the world. I pulled on a sweatshirt and opened it a few inches. A courier in a navy jacket held out a large envelope. "Are you Laura Quinn?" he asked. "Yes." "Need your signature." My name in his mouth felt oddly formal. I signed the little screen and he handed me the envelope. The return address was a law firm in Dallas. For a second, I thought of some administrative thing from my old job, some leftover account, but the first page killed that hope. The letter was titled in thick black letters, a phrase I had only ever heard on television, a demand that I immediately stop making statements that harmed Savannah's public image and business interests. It accused me of spreading lies about her integrity, interfering with customer relationships, and attempting to damage her brand. By the second paragraph, my hands had started to shake. By the last, the shaking had stopped. Something inside had moved past fear into a colder space. Gina came into the studio a few hours later to find the letter in the middle of my desk. She read it, jaw tightening. "This is not just petty now," she said. "She is trying to use the system to scare you into silence." "I know," I said. My voice sounded flat to my own ears. "I am not sure what to do next." She looked at me for a long moment, then reached for her phone. "I know someone who might," she said. "A client of mine, friend of a friend. She handles messy family business and small business disputes. Her name is Linda Dawson. Do you want me to ask if she will meet with you?" I nodded. "Yes, please." 2 days later, I sat in a quiet office in downtown Brookman, hands wrapped around a cup of water I had not touched. Linda was in her early 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and a calm that made the room feel larger. Awards and framed certificates lined the wall, but nothing about her manner felt showy. She had me walk her through everything: the letters from the bank, the exhibition, the anonymous message, his follow-up to invite the sender to identify themselves, unanswered, the correspondence with the retailer representative, including the note that they were pausing talks because of concerns raised that evening. Gina printed studio logs that showed where I had been at specific times, the late nights drafting hotel patterns, the hours I had logged in client projects, while Savannah's people claimed I had been out sabotaging her business. I spent long evenings on the phone with banks, moving from one security department to another, repeating my social security number and birth date until the numbers blurred. Slowly, a picture emerged. There was the card I had never applied for, opened in Dallas 3 months before I left Texas. There were small charges at first, then larger ones, all paid from accounts tied to an email address I did not recognize. The mailing address was my parents' house. When I told Linda what the bank had provided, she nodded. "People rarely start with the big move. They test the boundaries. Your sister uses your name like it's a spare key. We're going to change the locks." A few days after that, Linda called to say she had spoken to a financial advisor who knew my parents. "Your folks switched most of their accounts into joint management with Savannah about a year ago," she said. "He says she told them it was easier that way, that you were busy with your art and didn't want the hassle. Does that sound accurate to you?" I stared at the far wall of my apartment, at the small painting I'd bought from another artist at a street fair. "No," I said. "No one asked me." That's part of the story here, not the legal core of your case, but the context. She's been positioning herself as gatekeeper for a while. Hearing it laid out so plainly made me feel both foolish and strangely vindicated. All those comments about things not being my concern, all the time I had spent wondering if I was just imagining the power imbalance, now had a paper trail. Linda prepared a formal answer to Savannah's letter. I sat across from her while she typed. "We acknowledge receipt," she said as she worked. "We address each claim without giving ground. And then, very politely, we inform her counsel that if the false statements do not stop, we will file our own action for defamation, identity misuse, and intentional interference with your business. We attach just enough documentation that they know we're not bluffing." Watching her assemble the language felt like watching Gina refine a design. Same bones, different stakes. When the draft was ready, she turned the screen toward me. "This is not about revenge. It's about consequences. Are you comfortable signing your name to this?" I read every line. My hands did not shake when I picked up the pen. "Yes," I said. "I am." We sent the letter that afternoon. For a few days, everything went strangely quiet. No new emails from fake accounts, no calls from my parents. In the studio, life went on as if nothing major were shifting under my feet. We wrapped the remnants of the exhibition, packed my panels carefully, and moved some of them into storage for future shows. Gina joked about how drama seems to circle anything worth looking at. The silence broke on a Wednesday evening. I was rinsing brushes in my kitchen sink when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number from Texas. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my chest nudged me to answer. "Is this Mrs. Quinn?" I asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Carla," she said. "I used to work for your sister at her store. I got your attorney's card from a friend. Do you have a minute?" My shoulders tightened. "I do." She hesitated, then rushed on. "I saw some stuff online about what's going on. Your sister is telling people you're trying to ruin her, that you made up the fraud thing. The thing is, she's done this kind of stuff before, not with family, but with other owners, competitors, and I'm tired of keeping my mouth shut." The words came in uneven bursts, stories about Savannah leaning on smaller boutiques to drop certain brands, threatening to start rumors if they didn't, about signing another employees on a vendor agreement without telling her, about instructing staff to post fake reviews on rival business pages. "I don't know if any of this helps you, but if your lawyer wants to talk, I'm willing." After I hung up, I sat very still for a second, listening to the drip of water from the faucet. Then I called Linda. She called Carla the next day. By the end of the week, we had a written statement from her and from another former employee she pulled in, both willing to testify that Savannah had a pattern of using intimidation and deception when she wanted something. Linda spread all of it across her conference table one afternoon. Letters from banks, the security footage, emails from the gallery, former staff statements, details about the changes to my parents' finances. This is no longer a he said, she said between sisters. This is a documented pattern. Her counsel is not going to like what happens if this goes before a judge. That gives us leverage. I looked at the piles of paper and felt for once that the weight in the room was not pressing down on me, but pressing outwards, forming walls, structure, something solid. "They sent us an invitation to mediation," Linda added. "We will accept, but we will also prepare for a full hearing. That way, whichever path this takes, you're ready." The thought of sitting in a room with Savannah and a table of lawyers made my stomach flip, but the fear did not drown me this time. It floated alongside something else, something steadier. "What do you need from me now?" I asked. "Keep records of everything," she said. "Messages, calls, social media posts. Don't engage directly with her or with your parents about the case. Let me handle the talking. Your job is to keep living your life, keep working, and show up when it's time." When I stepped out of her office, downtown Brooklyn buzzed with the late afternoon rush. The air smelled of exhaust and street food. People moved around me, eyes on their own destinations. I walked toward the subway with the folder of copies under my arm, aware that whatever came next would not be simple, but also aware of something new. For the first time since this started, I was not just reacting to what Savannah threw at me. I was moving toward a line where her choices would stand before someone who could make them cost her something. The hearing date sat circled on my calendar at home, a small dark ring around a number. When I looked at it that night, I felt nerves, of course, but under them was a calm, anchored certainty. I was not going into that room as the younger sister trying to be believed. I was going as someone with proof, with people beside me, with a life I'd built without her. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and bright, one of those New York days when the sky is too clear to hide in. I stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse with Linda and tried to steady my breathing. The building loomed above us, heavy stone and tall windows. But the thing I was most aware of was the folder in Linda's hand that held months of my life in paper form. Inside, we passed through security and followed signs to a small civil courtroom. Rows of wooden benches faced a raised platform where the judge would sit. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee. On the right side of the room sat Savannah and her attorney, both in sleek, dark suits. My parents were behind them, dressed as if they were going to church, faces tight and guarded. Linda touched my arm in a quick, grounding gesture and led me to the table on the left. Noah slipped into the front row behind us, giving me a brief nod. I saw Gina take a seat next to him, her expression a mix of anger and quiet encouragement. When the clerk called the case, we all stood. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a kind but unsmiling face, took her seat and glanced down at the file in front of her. Formal words were spoken that I only half heard, and then Savannah's attorney began. He painted her as a hard-working business owner with a fragile reputation, a daughter who had stepped up to help her aging parents when I supposedly drifted away to chase my art. He spoke of my move to New York as if it were an abandonment, and of my recent actions as if I had suddenly resurfaced with the sole purpose of tearing her down. He used phrases like unstable tendencies and obsession with perceived slights. Every so often, Savannah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and my mother reached forward to squeeze her shoulder. Linda scribbled notes beside me, but did not interrupt. When it was our turn, she rose with a quiet confidence that made my shoulders ease a little. She began by stating in clear, simple sentences that our position was not a story about jealousy, but a matter of documented fraud and defamation. She did not raise her voice. She did not try to sound dramatic. She let the words do the work. First came the security footage. On the monitor set up near the judge, the grainy video played, showing the alley behind the gallery and the door to my studio. We watched the figure in a long coat walk up to the entrance in the middle of the night. The judge narrowed her eyes as Linda explained that the employee visible in the frame worked for Savannah and that there was no legitimate business reason for her to be near my locked space. Next, Linda presented the fraud alert letters, the ones from the bank thanking me for applications I had never filed and notifying me of charges on accounts I did not know existed. She connected those to the bank statements obtained through legal requests, highlighting the pattern of payments from my parents' address and from accounts controlled by Savannah. As each document was admitted into the record, the pile on the table in front of the judge grew. Screenshots of the anonymous emails sent to the gallery, records from the studio showing my logged work hours at the times I had supposedly been out sabotaging Savannah's business, copies of contracts from my past employers confirming that there had never been any claims of theft or misconduct. Then Linda called Noah. He walked to the witness stand with a calm that made me proud. He testified about the night of the exhibition, the way the rumors had started only after Savannah arrived, the email he had received that day, and the impact it had on the retailer's interest in my work. He answered Savannah's attorney's attempts to cast him as biased with polite, clipped responses that never wavered. After Noah came Carla, the former boutique employee. She was nervous at first, but Linda's questions were gentle and focused. Carla described how Savannah had instructed staff to post false reviews about competitor shops, how she had threatened suppliers who also worked with other stores, how signatures on certain documents had appeared above her own typed name even when she had not been present. When Savannah's attorney tried to suggest Carla was simply a disgruntled ex-employee, Linda slid a stack of corroborating statements from another former staff member across the table, and the judge accepted them with a thoughtful look. Finally, Linda requested that the court review the digital signature history associated with the disputed credit accounts. An expert from the bank stepped through the details, explaining how the applications had been submitted from a device registered to Savannah's home, how the e-signatures matched her records from other legitimate transactions, how my personal information had been inserted without my knowledge. Watching the trace of her online actions unfold on the screen felt surreal. This was not childhood name-calling or ugly stories whispered behind my back. This was data, time-stamped and verifiable. Savannah's attorney attempted to argue that someone else could have accessed her devices, that there might have been a mistake in the records, but the expert calmly explained that such a scenario would require a level of access and coincidence that bordered on impossible. When Savannah herself took the stand, she began with familiar lines. I was jealous. I had never been able to handle responsibility. My feelings had always overwhelmed my judgment. She talked about late-night phone calls from me that never happened, about alleged outbursts that no one else could remember. Linda waited until the end of that performance before beginning her cross-examination. She asked precise questions based on the documents already in evidence. Did Savannah recognize the email address associated with the fraudulent accounts? Did she deny that it was the same one she used to manage her online vendors? Did she dispute the location data that placed the applications at her home in Plano? At first, Savannah tried to give broad, evasive answers. The judge intervened twice to tell her to respond directly. Under the pressure of those repeated, narrowing questions, tiny cracks appeared in her composure. She admitted that she sometimes helped our parents with finances. She admitted that she had logged into bank portals on their behalf. She admitted that one of her employees might have been in the Brooklyn alley, though she claimed not to know why. When Linda asked if she had ever opened a line of credit using my information, she said no. Then Linda handed her a printed copy of the signature record and asked her to explain why the stylus strokes matched every other verified signature of hers on file. For a long moment, Savannah stared at the paper. Her mouth opened once, then closed. She looked toward her attorney, then toward her parents. They did not move. The judge watched all of this in silence. When Savannah finally murmured something about confusion and clerical error, it sounded thin even to my ears. By the time testimony ended, the energy in the room had shifted. My parents, who had arrived with their shoulders squared in defense, now sat with their hands folded, eyes on the table in front of them. They looked smaller than I remembered. The judge called a brief recess, then returned with her notes in order. We all stood when she entered and sat when she told us to. She summarized the evidence in a calm, measured tone. The fraudulent accounts opened in my name, the unauthorized use of my personal information, the defamatory email sent to a professional venue, the pattern of intimidation toward competitors outlined by former employees. She acknowledged that family conflict often came with conflicting memories and strong emotions, but she said that this particular case went way beyond hurt feelings. Then she ruled that Savannah was liable for misuse of my identity and defamation, that she was to provide restitution for the fraudulent accounts and damages associated with lost professional opportunities, that her boutique's accounts would be frozen pending further investigation by the appropriate authorities, and that a protective order would be entered to prevent any further contact with me for purposes of intimidation or harassment. The words did not arrive with dramatic music or gasps from the audience. They fell quietly into the room and altered its shape. Savannah stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. My mother looked from her to me with eyes full of something I could not name, a tangled mix of disbelief and dawning recognition. My father lifted a hand as if to reach for Savannah, then let it drop. When it was over, when we filed out into the hallway, Linda squeezed my shoulder. "You did well," she said. "This was never going to feel like a celebration, but you stood up for yourself in the only way that could make a lasting difference." Outside the courthouse, the city noise rushed around me. Cars, voices, the bark of a distant dog. Savannah and my parents emerged a few minutes later. For a moment, our eyes met across the steps. There was no shouting, no final speech, just a shared understanding that the ground between us had shifted in a way that could not be undone. In the days that followed, the practical consequences unfolded. Investors quietly distanced themselves from Savannah's boutique. A local paper ran a small piece about the investigation into alleged financial misconduct. Partnerships she had boasted about for years began to announce that they were reevaluating their relationship with her brand. None of it brought me joy in the way I once thought justice might. It simply felt necessary, like a bruise rising to the surface after a long, hidden impact. My life in Brooklyn did not suddenly turn into a movie montage of success, but it did begin to feel more solid. Noah offered me a standing collaboration with his gallery, a chance to contribute to curated shows throughout the year and to connect with designers who wanted textile work for their own projects. Gina shifted my role at the studio, trusting me with more creative decisions and clients who wanted the kind of riskier patterns I once kept in my sketchbooks. A few months after the hearing, I received an email from a gallery in Chelsea. The director had seen photos from Noah's exhibition and asked if I would consider a solo show the following spring. I read the message twice, then 3 times, and felt a quiet warmth spread through my ribs. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I started hosting small workshops in the back room of Noah's gallery, inviting young designers from community colleges and co-working spaces. We talked about pattern and color, but also about contracts, about boundaries, about recognizing red flags in workplaces and relationships. I did not tell them every detail of my own story, but I used what I had learned to help them protect their own names. As for my family, I chose distance. I answered the occasional practical email from my parents with brief, polite sentences. I did not engage in long explanations or replays of what had happened. My grief for the family I had wished for came in short, sharp waves and then passed. I allowed myself to feel it without letting it drag me back into old habits. One evening, months later, I stood alone in my Clinton Hill apartment, looking at a new piece hanging on the wall. The pattern was less fractured than my earlier work, still complex but with more open space, lines that curved instead of only cutting. The city sounds drifted in through the window, and for the first time in a very long time, my chest felt light. If you were listening to this and any of it sounds familiar, if you have ever been treated as the unstable one simply because you stopped absorbing someone else's damage, I want you to know you are not imagining it. There are ways to protect yourself that do not require you to become cruel in return. You can walk away, you can gather proof, you can find people who see you clearly and stand beside you when the room tilts. I am telling this from a small apartment in Brooklyn that I pay for with work that has my own name on it. I would honestly like to hear where you are listening from and whether you have lived through your own version of this kind of betrayal. If you feel like sharing it, tell me how you got through it or how you are still trying to. Sometimes the simple act of saying,